This is a Fox News alert. Breaking tonight, FBI raid Mountain Men star Eustace Conway's property.
It began like any other quiet morning in the Blue Ridge Mountains, mist clinging to the treetops, the sound of distant crows echoing through the valley, the faint hum of wind across Turtle Island Preserve. For 30 years, this land had been Eustace Conway's living testament to a forgotten America, a place where the past still breathed, and machines had no place. But beneath the log walls of his hand-built cabin, something ancient had been waiting, sealed off from the world. When environmental inspectors arrived to assess the soil stability beneath Eustace's home, they expected nothing more than damp clay and root webs. But the sensors told a different story. Beneath the cabin floor, nearly 10 feet down, was a hollow space that shouldn't have been there. At first, the crew assumed it was an air pocket caused by erosion. Then, a sharp thud of wood echoed as a probe struck something solid. They cleared away layers of slate and packed earth until the outline of a hatch began to emerge. Hand-hewn, sealed tight, and bound by rusted nails that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. The team paused, unsure whether to continue. When Eustace arrived, his face unreadable. He examined the spot for a long moment before finally saying, "Be careful what you dig up." Some things were built to stay quiet. Still, the work continued. The hinges groaned as the hatch lifted, releasing a cold breath of air from the earth, thick, damp, and almost metallic. Flashlights pierced the darkness below, revealing a ladder descending into a narrow passage. Dust swirled through the beam like ash. One of the inspectors muttered, "It's not natural. Someone built this." Eustace didn't answer. He just stared into the dark, as if recognizing something long forgotten. The investigators descended carefully, boots sinking into soft soil. What they found beneath the cabin wasn't an ordinary cellar, nor an accident of nature. It was deliberate, a space shaped by human hands, a secret that had waited patiently under the mountain, buried beneath the life of the man who claimed to need nothing but the land. And the deeper they went, the stranger it became. To understand what investigators stumbled upon beneath Eustace Conway's cabin, you have to understand the man who built it. For decades, Eustace wasn't just a name, he was a myth. They called him the last American man, a philosopher of dirt and pine who turned his back on electricity and built his world by hand. Deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, he carved out 1,000 acres of wilderness and called it Turtle Island Preserve, a living classroom where the modern world stopped at the gate. Here, students learned to tan hides, forge knives, track deer, and build fires from stone. No phones, no engines, no screens. Only the rhythm of wind and wood. To many, he was a relic. To others, a prophet. Eustace believed that survival wasn't about fear, it was about connection. "The earth doesn't belong to us," he often said. "We belong to it." For 30 years, that belief defined his every action. But those who worked alongside him noticed something changing in recent years. He grew quieter, more reclusive, as if his lessons had turned inward. He spoke of energy, of soil memory, of listening to what the land wanted to tell him. Apprentices recalled seeing him vanish into the woods for days, returning covered in dirt and ash, muttering about a project he was finishing in secret. No one questioned him. After all, Eustace was a man who thrived on mystery. But now, as inspectors dug beneath his cabin, the truth began to surface. Turtle Island had always been a place where the past was preserved. But beneath its heart, something even older was waiting. Something Eustace had been working on for years. And when that wooden hatch opened, the line between myth and man blurred forever. It began innocently. A routine environmental safety inspection ordered in early 2024 after reports of shifting ground near Turtle Island's main homestead. A recent rainstorm had caused minor flooding in the lower pastures, and officials wanted to ensure the cabin's foundation was stable. But stability was never Eustace Conway's concern. He built his life on controlled chaos, and this time, the ground itself was keeping his secret. As a team of 3 inspectors began their scan, the equipment started to misread, detecting not bedrock but empty space beneath the cabin's southern wall. One of the men joked about buried treasure. But when the reading held steady, laughter turned to silence. They dug a small test pit and uncovered a section of timber bracing that didn't match the cabin's age. Eustace watched quietly as they uncovered more, until a flat piece of slate gave way to the edge of a handmade hatch, sealed with wax and rope, reinforced by nails hand-forged decades ago. One inspector turned to Eustace and asked, "Did you build this?" Eustace's answer was as cryptic as it was chilling. Not recently. By law, they had to investigate further. Eustace didn't stop them. He only gave a single warning. What's under there isn't danger, it's memory. When they finally pried open the hatch, a cold breath of air rose up. Still, heavy, untouched by sunlight for perhaps half a century. The flashlight beams revealed a wooden ladder leading into darkness. No wiring, no stone, just dirt walls carved smooth by hand. They climbed down one by one. The silence was absolute. Not even the forest above seemed to breathe. When the last man reached the floor, his light swept across something that froze them all. The walls weren't just dirt. They were built, reinforced with timber and clay, carved with markings that looked deliberate. Someone had lived here. Someone had planned this, and that someone was standing right above them. The deeper they explored, the more impossible it became. The chamber stretched roughly 30 feet across, a hand-dug masterpiece supported by beams of chestnut and oak, wood extinct from modern use. The air was still, cool, almost sacred. The scent was a strange mix of oil, leather, and old earth. Along one wall sat shelves carved directly into the clay, stacked with glass jars, dried herbs, and parchment rolls wrapped in twine. In another corner, a simple wooden cot rested beside a table made from reclaimed barnwood. Everything was primitive, yet precise, like a craftsman's museum frozen in time. A single lantern hung from the ceiling, its wick long dry. Nearby sat an iron kettle, a hand-forged knife, and a row of clay pots labeled with faint charcoal handwriting. Beans, salt, ash. Nothing about this space suggested fear. It wasn't built as a panic bunker or fallout shelter. It felt intentional, thoughtful. Then, one of the investigators noticed something unusual near the far wall. A crude ventilation shaft, fashioned from hollowed saplings tied with cord. The design was ingenious, creating natural airflow. A pulley system attached to the ceiling turned a small wooden fan, powered by a counterweight filled with stones. "It's like he engineered it without tools," one inspector whispered. They took photos, cataloged each object, careful not to disturb anything. Eustace stood at the hatch above, silent, watching. When they asked him what this was, he simply said, "A study, a place to remember what man forgot." But then came the discovery that changed everything. A stack of leather-bound journals, carefully wrapped in cloth and sealed inside a wooden chest. That's when they realized they hadn't found just a survivalist's hideout. They had uncovered a record. A record of a man trying to live beneath the surface of the world, to understand it, maybe even to outlast it. And what those pages contained would redefine who Eustace Conway really was. When investigators carefully opened the chest, a wave of musty air escaped. The scent of ink, age, and oil. Inside were leather-bound notebooks, hand-stitched and weathered by time. The first page bore a simple inscription: "If the world forgets how to live, I'll teach it again, from beneath the roots." The journals span decades, each one filled with sketches, charts, and passages written in Eustace Conway's distinctive looping handwriting. At first, the entries read like field notes: temperature readings, soil moisture levels, humidity data, but as they continued, they became something deeper. Meditations on isolation, on self-reliance, on the human need to reconnect with the earth. One entry read, "I came down here to see how long a man can live on what he remembers. The air is different under the soil. It feels like truth." Investigators began to understand this was no bunker, no survival shelter. It was a laboratory of the human spirit. He wasn't hiding from collapse. He was testing what it meant to survive without society. Among the pages were notes about sound, how the forest's heartbeat could still be felt underground. There were experiments on storing energy through motion, water condensation techniques, and diagrams showing cycles of air and light. But one entry caught particular attention. "The Earth breathes slower than man. To learn from it, you must become part of it." Some inspectors later described the moment as haunting, as if they were reading the thoughts of a man who had lived both above and below the world at once. The journals were proof that Eustace's philosophy wasn't just performance. It was a lifelong experiment in reconnection. Yet even with all that insight, the most disturbing discovery still lay ahead. Because behind those journals, carved into the back wall, was something sealed, something deliberately kept from the light. And when they found what was hidden there, even Eustace himself hesitated to speak. In the dim light of their flashlights, investigators discovered an adjoining compartment, accessible through a narrow earthen tunnel. What lay beyond blurred the line between primitive and genius. Along the walls were mechanical contraptions built from scavenged parts, pulleys made of carved wood, gears shaped from melted scrap metal, and a makeshift hydro pump connected to a small underground stream. At first glance, it looked like the remnants of some forgotten workshop, but when one inspector rotated the hand crank on a nearby flywheel, the air stirred, faintly, yet unmistakably. It powered a tiny fan. Another device, half submerged in the stream, appeared to convert flowing water into rotary motion. This wasn't random tinkering. It was engineering in its purest form. Innovation stripped of technology. The kind of invention born not in laboratories, but in solitude. Pinned to one wall was a sheet of parchment labeled "Continuity of Function Without Dependency." It outlined a system of perpetual utility, how energy, motion, and survival could coexist without fuel or electricity. In the margins, a note read, "Technology should serve life, not replace it." Experts later called it analog sustainability, an attempt to prove civilization didn't need progress to thrive. Everything worked in balance: gravity, water, air, muscle. Eustace had built his own world, a living ecosystem beneath his cabin, untouched by modern hands. One investigator, a veteran of disaster response work, summed it up perfectly. "It's not a doomsday shelter. It's a time capsule. For when the rest of us forget how to build things that last." But as they continued deeper, one section of the tunnel stood out, reinforced with heavier timber, sealed by an iron-banded door. Its surface was etched with unfamiliar markings. Symbols, circles, and hand-carved letters faded almost beyond recognition. When they asked what was inside, Eustace replied quietly, "That room's for when the world ends." And the air grew cold as he reached for the latch. The iron hinges groaned as the door creaked open, releasing a low rush of air. A faint glow from bioluminescent moss clung to the walls like green fire, casting light across a space smaller but stranger than anything they'd seen before. Inside were shelves lined with glass jars, not filled with food or seeds this time, but soil samples, each labeled by date, altitude, and moisture content. Notebooks lay open on a table carved from rough pine, their pages covered in data and sketches of plants sprouting in total darkness. A faint hum came from a corner where vines, somehow alive, crept along the earthen wall. Nearby, Eustace had placed a small basin of water beneath a reflective surface. An attempt to redirect sunlight down a series of mirrors through shafts above ground. It was crude but brilliant, turning a few seconds of daylight into hours of dim illumination. Pinned above the table was a faded sheet of paper with a hand-drawn symbol, the same markings carved on the door. Beneath it, a single sentence. This is not to hide from the world. It's to learn how to live when it ends. Investigators realized this wasn't superstition or paranoia. It was visionary experimentation, an effort to understand how life could sustain itself underground, independent of civilization. In the corner, a small wooden box held jars of what appeared to be bioluminescent moss cultures, labeled Light Harvest. Another contained fungi samples tagged Protein Growth. Eustace wasn't preparing to escape humanity. He was studying how to preserve it. One of the inspectors whispered. He wasn't trying to survive the apocalypse. He was trying to rebuild after it. Eustace only nodded, his eyes reflecting the soft green light. This place, he said, isn't for me. It's for whoever remembers how to listen when everything else goes silent. And with that, they stepped back into the tunnel, leaving behind a room built not out of fear, but out of faith in what the earth could still teach. As investigators ventured farther into the chamber, the air thickened, the smell of oil, earth, and something faintly chemical. Against the back wall stood a series of sealed glass containers, each meticulously labeled and dated. Inside were preserved animals, frogs, snakes, and small birds suspended in amber-colored liquid. It was unsettling but strangely reverent, like a cross between a museum exhibit and a ritual. Beside the jars lay stacks of handwritten papers, detailing a project Eustace had titled Biological Continuity. The notes described experiments in preservation using natural oils, herbal compounds, and ambient soil heat instead of refrigeration. One entry read, "If nature preserves the seed through winter, man should learn to preserve life through decay." Investigators debated whether it was science or spirituality, or perhaps both. The samples weren't grotesque trophies. They were data points in a philosophy, a quest to decode the balance between death and regeneration. Several jars had already begun decomposing, releasing faint bubbles as organic matter fed bacterial cultures. Nearby sat clay pots rigged with copper coils and stones, a primitive compost heating system designed to create low, sustained warmth. In his notes, Eustace called it Earth's heartbeat, a renewable energy born of decay. It was genius in its simplicity, eerie in its devotion. Then came the most haunting discovery. A message scratched into a wooden beam above the workbench, barely legible beneath layers of dust and soot. It read, "What dies here feeds what survives." Those 6 words captured everything about Eustace Conway's experiment. A man trying to mirror nature's endless cycle of creation, consumption, and rebirth. But as investigators turned to leave, their flashlights caught something glinting in the soil near the floor. The first trace of the message carved into stone, the one that would define everything they had found below. Carved into the back wall of the chamber, just above the earthen floor, was a phrase etched with deliberate, practiced strokes. The letters were uneven, hand-chiseled, but unmistakable. The earth provides if man remembers how to listen. The words stopped everyone in silence. They weren't just a quote. They were a warning, a manifesto, a truth buried as deeply as the room itself. For years, Eustace Conway had lived as a living contradiction, a man out of time, teaching ancient lessons to a modern world obsessed with convenience. But this inscription revealed the core of everything he believed. It wasn't about retreating from society. It was about rebuilding the bond between humanity and the planet that sustained it. Investigators took photos, their flashlights casting long shadows across the carved letters. One described it later as standing inside a sermon written in dirt. Nearby, another phrase appeared, smaller, nearly erased by age. When they find this, I hope they understand. And they did. Suddenly, all the strange devices, the preserved animals, the quiet journals made sense. This wasn't paranoia. It was a blueprint for renewal. Eustace had built a living classroom underground. One meant not for the world of his time, but for the one that might come after it. A world forced to start again. By the time the team resurfaced, the air outside felt different, fresher, heavier with meaning. The wind through the trees seemed to echo that same message. The earth provides, if man listens. Yet one question lingered among them all. Was Eustace finished with his experiment, or was he still quietly perfecting it? The answer would come soon enough when the man himself decided to speak. When the story of the hidden chamber broke, speculation spread faster than wildfire. Some called it a survivalist bunker, others a madman's tomb. But when Eustace Conway finally addressed the rumors, his voice was calm, almost amused. "It's not a bunker," he said. "It's a mirror. It shows what we've forgotten." He explained that the chamber beneath his cabin was not meant for hiding, but for learning, a place to test the boundaries of human endurance and ecological balance. "If I can live here, under the soil, without a single plug or switch," he said, "then maybe humanity still has a chance." He had spent years descending into that underground world, recording temperature, moisture, and silence. It wasn't about escaping society. It was about proving a point that nature already has the answers, if man learns humility long enough to hear them. Investigators left Turtle Island changed. They had expected conspiracy or eccentricity. What they found was faith, not in religion, but in the earth itself. The chamber remains sealed today, preserved as Eustace's private experiment. He rarely speaks of it now, but those who visit Turtle Island say that on quiet nights, he can still be found near the cabin, lantern in hand, staring at the ground as if listening for something deep below. And maybe he is. Because what they found beneath Eustace Conway's home wasn't madness or mystery. It was proof, carved in wood, written in soil, that one man still believes we can live in harmony with the land that made us. Beneath his cabin, Eustace Conway didn't build a bunker. He built a promise, a reminder that survival isn't about running from the world. It's about remembering how to live with it. The night was unnaturally still, that kind of Appalachian quiet where the forest seems to hold its breath. A storm lingered somewhere beyond the ridge, its low rumble swallowed by the trees. Just past midnight, a faint orange glow appeared deep among the pines. At first, locals thought it was lightning, or maybe someone night hiking the back trail. But when the shape of a man came into view, hauling something heavy under the beam of a swaying lantern, they realized it was Eustace Conway, the hermit, the teacher, the myth they called the last American man. He was alone. No camera crew, no apprentices, no students, just him, the wind, and the weight of whatever he was dragging through the mud. His boots sank into the soft ground as thunder cracked above the ridge. Each strike of his shovel echoed like a heartbeat through the dark. Neighbors along the dirt road reported seeing his lantern moving in slow, deliberate arcs, stopping, then starting again, as if he was measuring every inch of the earth. Hours later, when the light finally disappeared, the forest went silent again. But the next morning, hikers noticed something unusual near the creek bed. A patch of freshly turned soil, perfectly oval, framed by old oak roots. Rumors spread before the sun was fully up. Some said he was burying relics from a lost Cherokee site. Others whispered he'd been conducting a return-to-earth ritual, something he'd hinted at in his classes but never performed. One man swore he saw smoke rising long after Eustace had gone, like the ground itself was breathing. By afternoon, the sheriff's office had 3 separate reports of suspicious activity near Turtle Island Preserve. When dispatch asked for details, the caller's voice trembled. "It was him. I know it was. He was burying something, and whatever it was, it wasn't small." At 8:13 p.m., a patrol car rolled up the mountain road. Through the mist, the beam of its spotlight caught the edge of a shovel half buried in mud, and a set of fresh footprints leading straight into the woods. The radio crackled.
Units 3 and 5, respond to Turtle Island. Possible illegal excavation on private land.
The dispatcher hesitated before repeating it. Even over the static, she could hear it. The sound of wind moving through the trees, carrying something faint, rhythmic, almost human. Whatever Eustace Conway was doing out there that night, it wasn't finished. To most people, Turtle Island Preserve is a place of wonder. A 1,000-acre sanctuary carved into the Blue Ridge Mountains, where time seems to have stopped 100 years ago. But to those who live near it, the land is something else entirely, alive. Locals swear the soil hums before storms, that fires burn slower there, and that Eustace Conway chose that valley not by chance, but because he could feel its pulse. Eustace built his world from raw timber and belief. Every cabin, every forge, every plank of split oak was crafted by hand. No machines, no shortcuts. His home was his message, proof that humanity could still live as part of nature, not above it. But what outsiders call self-reliance, those who know the hills call communion. The Cherokee, whose ancestors once walked this land, say Turtle Island sits on one of the breathing places of the earth, a crossing point between the seen and the unseen. For decades, Eustace lived in harmony with those whispers, teaching, building, surviving. But lately, his behavior had changed. Students noticed him taking long walks alone after dark, muttering to himself, eyes scanning the ground like he was searching for something. He spoke of balance, of returning what never belonged to man. An old friend once asked him if he ever felt lonely out there. Eustace just smiled and said, "The forest talks plenty if you know how to listen." That's why when hikers later claimed they saw his lantern moving through the trees, slow, deliberate, and silent, nobody in Boone or Watauga County laughed. Around here, when Eustace moves, the mountain pays attention. The Cherokee elders who still visit the preserve offered a different explanation. They said the night Eustace was seen digging wasn't coincidence. It fell on the full flower moon, the same lunar cycle used for ancestral rituals of returning energy to the land. To them, it wasn't trespass or crime, it was ceremony. But as sheriff's deputies prepared to investigate, one old man at the general store muttered a warning they'd soon remember.
"If he's bearing something, you best pray he's not trying to wake it up."
By sunrise, the whispers had already reached the nearest town. 2 hikers who'd been camping along the ridge came forward with eerily similar stories. The first, a retired park ranger named Bill Harker, said he'd seen a lantern glow weaving through the trees around midnight. Too steady to be lightning, too deliberate to be an animal. Through the fog, he could just make out a figure, tall and thin, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. He was dragging something behind him, Harker told deputies. Not a bag. More like a box. Heavy. The second witness, a woman named Claire Jennings, had camped less than a mile away. Around the same time, she woke to the sound of metal striking earth. Rhythmic, patient, like someone digging. Then came the smell, sharp and strange, like burning cedar mixed with oil. It made my stomach turn, she said. It wasn't smoke. It was something sweet and wrong. When questioned separately, both described the same detail. The sound of chains clinking, faint but deliberate. Deputies brushed it off at first, until Claire showed them a photo she'd taken through the fog. A single lantern glow framed by what looked like wagon tracks. By noon, word reached the county sheriff. They knew the land was Eustace Conway's, and none of them wanted to be the one to trespass on Turtle Island without reason. Still, the reports kept coming. Another neighbor claimed he saw Eustace's old truck parked at the trailhead that night. Engine still warm the next morning. A week earlier, Eustace had told visitors that the land was ready to reclaim what's hers. No one had understood what he meant. Now, everyone had their own theory. Some said he was performing an old mountain ritual. Others whispered that something had died. Maybe a horse, maybe something else. But one thing every witness agreed on. The man in the woods moved with purpose. He wasn't wandering. He was finishing something he'd started long ago. And whatever that was, the earth now held it tight beneath her roots. The story spread faster than wildfire through Boone, Blowing Rock, and the mountain hollows in between. At the diner, at the feed store, even at church. Everyone had a version of what Eustace Conway might have buried. Some claimed he'd finally gone mad, sealing away journals or inventions he didn't want discovered. Others swore he'd found something ancient on his land. Cherokee relics, bones, or even treasure left by Civil War deserters. But the darker rumors hit harder. A man who once worked as an apprentice at Turtle Island told reporters Eustace used to speak in riddles during evening campfires. He said the land remembers everything, that when man takes too much, the soil demands something back. When asked what he meant, the man had laughed nervously. At the time, I thought it was just poetry. Now, I'm not so sure. Soon, excerpts from one of Eustace's old field journals began circulating online. Pages allegedly found in a used bookstore in Asheville. One quote stood out, "When man forgets, the earth remembers, but remembering hurts." It was dated almost 20 years ago. The same year he began building his main cabin. Locals started to wonder if what he buried wasn't an object at all, but an idea, or maybe guilt. Rumors emerged of an incident decades earlier, a failed experiment involving soil energy or preservation. No one could verify it, but it fit the growing mythology around Turtle Island, a place where science and spirituality blurred into something deeper. When deputies finally drove up the gravel road leading to the preserve, the morning mist hung low and still. One officer later admitted that even before they reached the gate, he could feel it. The pressure, the hum beneath the ground. By the time they reached the main trail, a single oak stood out among the rest, its bark carved with strange, looping symbols. At its base, the dirt looked freshly turned. The lead investigator adjusted his cap, exhaled, and said quietly, "Whatever this is, it isn't just a hole in the ground." And with that, the digging began. By the time the first police trucks reached the clearing, the sky had turned the color of steel. The forest was hushed, too still, too watchful. The team moved carefully, boots sinking into soft soil, eyes drawn to the oval mound rising beside an ancient oak. It wasn't random or careless. The dirt was packed with precision, layered with pine needles and clay, as if someone had meant it to last. Deputies marked off the site with yellow tape, but even they seemed reluctant to cross it. "It doesn't feel like a crime scene," one muttered. "Feels like a grave." Photographs revealed something stranger. The oak beside the mound bore carved shapes, spirals, lines, and one symbol that resembled the Cherokee mark for balance. Beneath its roots, a faint outline of shovel marks stretched toward the creek. Whoever buried it had hauled it far from the road. This wasn't impulse. It was ceremony. Reporters arrived by noon, drawn by whispers of police digging up Turtle Island. Locals watched from the gate as rangers and archaeologists stepped through the boundary line. Drones hovered overhead, catching a wide shot of the perfect symmetry of the mound. 30 feet long, 10 wide, 6 high. Not the work of one night. Still, everyone waited for confirmation. What did he bury? A ranger brushed away the top layer of pine needles and noticed fragments of wax-coated canvas buried just below the surface. The soil smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. "There's something wrapped down there," he called out. Within hours, the dig began. Cameras rolled. Officers braced for what they feared most: bones. But Eustace Conway's name carried weight, and so did his legend. Every shovel of dirt brought the same question: was this a mystery or a message? By sundown, they reached the first layer of burlap, then the pitch-sealed canvas. And as one deputy tapped his spade against the next layer, wood, everyone took a step back. It wasn't a grave, it was a chest. And whatever waited inside, it had been buried with intention. Under the glare of portable floodlights, the excavation continued into the night. The air turned heavy with tension, that peculiar silence right before truth meets daylight. The wooden chest, sealed in resin and wrapped in canvas, was wedged into the ground like it had been planted there. The team worked slowly, brushing away the soil inch by inch until the edges revealed crude, hand-forged nails and wax stamped with the symbol of a turtle shell. Forensics expected the worst. Officers cleared the area, radioing the station for a coroner's standby. The cameras stayed rolling. Then came the moment, a crowbar slipping under the lid, wood groaning as the seal cracked. Inside wasn't what anyone imagined. No bones, no blood, no body. Instead, tools. Old, rusted, yet carefully arranged. A blacksmith's hammer, hand drills, a set of woodworking chisels, all wrapped in oiled leather. Beneath them, bound notebooks, more than a dozen, their pages handwritten and water-stained. And at the very bottom, rows of glass jars filled with seeds, each labeled with the names of plants native to Appalachia: corn, amaranth, sorghum, bean. It was a time capsule, part history, part warning. One investigator flipped open the first notebook and froze. Inside were sketches of irrigation systems, solar stills, and root cellars. Detailed plans for self-sufficient living. At the top of one page, a line in Eustace's handwriting read, "If the world forgets how to grow, the land will teach again." They documented everything: photos, samples, GPS coordinates. But as they prepared to lift the chest from the pit, a deputy's shovel struck something else. A hollow sound beneath the dirt. There was a second compartment. Another layer. The crew hesitated, glancing at one another. The first find had been hopeful, even poetic. But this next one? It felt heavier, older. Someone whispered, "He buried something under the message." And for the second time that night, they began to dig. The The second box was smaller, metal, not wood, rusted at the corners, wrapped in a sheet of deer skin tied with the hemp cord. Every motion to unearth it sent a cold ripple through the air. One of the archaeologists swore the soil felt charged, like static before lightning. They pried it loose with care and set it on a tarp. When the lock gave, a metallic click echoed through the clearing. The lid lifted to reveal a sight that stopped everyone mid-breath. Inside lay hand-carved figurines, stone relics, and a ring of black river stones arranged in a perfect circle. Each figure bore markings that looked both human and animal, hybrids with exaggerated limbs, some with eyes inlaid with mica flakes that shimmered under the floodlight. Folded between them was parchment filled with symmetrical symbols. Each matched to Cherokee iconography. One word stood out when translated later: Selu. The Corn Mother, spirit of renewal and balance. The discovery drew the attention of tribal historians, who arrived within days. Their conclusion was startling. These weren't random artifacts. They were ceremonial objects used in rituals meant to reconnect land and spirit, to return energy to the soil. In the center of the chest rested a single river stone, perfectly smooth, painted with concentric white rings. Beneath it, a note written in Eustace Conway's steady hand, returned with gratitude. What was borrowed is home again. When questioned later, Eustace admitted the items had been entrusted to him decades earlier by a Cherokee elder, gifts meant to teach respect for the old ways. "It wasn't mine to keep," he said softly. The ground called for it back. What some had called suspicious, others now called sacred. The lead investigator closed his notebook, looked at the mound, and whispered, "He didn't bury evidence. He buried balance." But none of them knew. The most unsettling part of the mystery wasn't what Eustace had buried. It was what he hadn't. When the boxes were hauled from the earth and cataloged, the official story came quickly. Too quickly, some thought. The sheriff's department declared it a misunderstanding. Private burial of personal effects and cultural items. Case closed. No foul play, no crime, but that explanation didn't sit right with everyone who'd been there. Body cam audio leaked weeks later captured something that changed the tone entirely. As officers packed up their equipment, one mic left running caught Eustace Conway saying quietly, almost to himself, "They weren't ready for what's still deeper." The phrase spread like wildfire across online forums. Conspiracy channels dissected every word. What did he mean by deeper? Was there another chamber beneath the one already found? Some claimed ground-penetrating radar scans showed another hollow space, but no official documents ever confirmed it. When reporters pressed Eustace for answers, he smiled in that calm, mountain-born way and said, "People see mystery where there's just meaning. I buried lessons, not secrets." But he wouldn't elaborate. To his apprentices, though, the story sounded familiar. Years before, he told them about the cycles of forgetting, that civilization destroys itself every few generations, and the land must be ready to start again. Some believe what he buried wasn't just symbolic. They think he built something, or preserved something, meant for that next beginning. Still, publicly, he stuck to the same line. It's a time capsule, a message for anyone who forgets how to live. Privately, one ranger who helped with the dig said that when he shook Eustace's hand before leaving, the man leaned close and whispered, "Don't dig any further. You'll just find yourself." Was that metaphor or warning? The official report went to storage, sealed, labeled as "No further action required." But within Turtle Island, the soil still bore the faint outline of the mound, like a scar that refused to fade. And every now and then, Hikers still claim they see a lantern moving between the trees, as if the digging never really stopped. When experts analyzed the recovered journals, they realized they weren't field notes. They were manifestos of survival. Every page mapped out Eustace Conway's vision of rebirth. Seed banks, earthen shelters, self-sustaining energy drawn from nature itself. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. The notebooks described more than farming or preservation. They explored the resonance between man and soil, the transfer of life energy through grounding and vibration. In one entry, Eustace wrote, "Every act of waste is an echo that shakes the roots. Every kindness strengthens them." The writings blurred the line between philosophy and science, echoing native beliefs of cyclical balance. He wrote about rewilding not just land, but the human spirit, a conscious return to humility. When man builds over mystery, he loses both. One passage read, "Archaeologists dismiss the ideas as romantic survivalism, but spiritual ecologists saw something else, a manual for coexistence." Then came the revelation buried in the margins, sketches of an underground living system. Airflow vents, light shafts, even notes on geothermal heating. The blueprints matched the structure later found beneath his cabin in previous inspections. It became clear that Eustace wasn't just writing about self-reliance. He was building a prototype for it. He'd spent decades designing a world that could survive without electricity, fossil fuels, or modern dependence. A world that could outlast collapse. The journals ended with one final line, written shakily, as if his hand trembled. "If they ever come looking, they'll find the Earth ready. But will they be?" For many, that was proof of purpose. For others, it was prophecy. Either way, Eustace had done more than live off the land. He turned it into scripture. Weeks after the investigation ended, reporters returned to Turtle Island expecting silence. Instead, they found something remarkable. The mound was gone. In its place bloomed a wild bed of mountain daisies, goldenrod, and native mint. When asked, Eustace said he hadn't planted them. "The ground chose," he answered softly. He invited a few of the investigators back, guiding them down the same trail they dug through months earlier. The air was lighter now, peaceful. Where the chest had been pulled out, the soil had settled perfectly. No hole, no scar, just renewal. He stood quietly for a long moment before speaking. "The land heals faster when you stop asking it to explain itself." One officer asked him if he'd bury anything again. Eustace just smiled. "Only what's worth remembering." Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, they watched him walk toward the tree line with a small spade in hand and a single jar of seeds. No cameras, no reporters, just a man and the earth that had become his only witness. Locals say the flowers at the site never stopped blooming, even through frost. Some believe he planted something more than seeds that night. Maybe faith, maybe warning. The legend now lives on in whispers, that beneath Turtle Island lies not treasure, but testament. A reminder that while the world races ahead, some men dig backward, toward truth. And as the wind moves through the pines, carrying that deep, resonant hum, it's hard not to hear his words echoing again. "Everything I've ever hidden was meant to be found, just not too soon." The camera fades to black, the forest breathing in rhythm. What lies beneath Turtle Island may not be sinister, but it may be sacred. The lawsuits, the land, and the rumors no one expected. The night is unnervingly still. A sudden crack of emergency radio static slices through the darkness, followed by flashes of blue lights bouncing between towering trees. A ranger moves slowly along a dirt road, his flashlight cutting into the woods that most people would never dare to enter. 1 minute ago, Eustace Conway finally broke his silence. And what he revealed about the lawsuits, the investigations, and the land he nearly lost changes everything you thought you knew about mountain men. Old newspaper clippings slam onto the screen. Zoning threats, county documents, heated letters from neighbors. A map fades in over Turtle Island Preserve, its borders outlined in stark white, the same borders that fueled years of disputes. Rumors swirl like smoke. Property lines contested by frustrated neighbors. Claims that Eustace's untraditional buildings broke codes. Hikers who went missing miles from his land, yet somehow the internet still dragged Turtle Island into the conversation. These stories were never proven, never tied to Eustace, but they spread anyway, carried by gossip, fear, and online speculation. In the modern world, truth crawls, but rumors sprint. Shots of social media threads, blurry photos, dramatic thumbnails, and small-town chatter flicker by like a wildfire. Every rumor adds fuel. Every exaggeration becomes another weight on his shoulders. And then, silence. Blue lights fade. The woods return to darkness. Wind moves through the trees like a warning. He didn't walk away from mountain men because he wanted to disappear from TV, but because the life he fought to protect was being threatened from every direction. A final beat. Cold, still, heavy. And tonight, you'll hear the moment Eustace finally admitted why he had no choice but to leave. Eustace Conway's story didn't begin with fame or cameras or conflict. It began in the quiet corners of the American wilderness, long before the world ever learned his name. As a child, while most kids spent summers in air-conditioned rooms, Eustace was learning to sleep under the stars. At 12 years old, he built his first primitive shelter. No blueprints, no power tools, just instinct and determination. By his teenage years, he was riding horses across entire states, guided only by the sun, the wind, and the terrain beneath him. His life was never about rebellion. It was about alignment. Alignment with nature, with simplicity, with the old ways that modern society had forgotten Turtle Island Preserve became the crown jewel of the vision. Hundreds of acres of raw, living wilderness where people could touch the past with their own hands. Visitors learned to build fires without matches, craft tools from stone, and see the world without the noise of engines, clocks, or screens. To Eustace, Turtle Island wasn't a business. It was a sanctuary, a place where he could teach, protect, and preserve a culture vanishing faster every year. But even as he embraced solitude, the outside world kept closing in. Curious, skeptical, and often confused by the idea of a man choosing to live outside the rules everyone else accepted. He wasn't trying to be different. He simply was. The last American frontiersman, living in a modern age that didn't know what to do with him. When mountain men first reached out to Eustace, the idea sounded harmless. Show the world how he lived, teach lost skills, inspire others to reconnect with nature. But with fame came a new kind of invasion, one Eustace was never prepared for. At first it was small, a few fans driving up the long gravel road just to see where he lived. Then more came. Some stayed too long, some wandered onto trails they didn't understand. Others stepped past warning signs, mistaking Turtle Island for a public attraction instead of a fragile preserve. People treated his home like a national park, a filming location, a backdrop for their selfies. Fame, he would later admit, was a visitor that didn't know how to leave. Filming brought its own burdens. Crews needed lighting, staging, movement, drama. But Eustace didn't stage anything. He didn't rehearse, didn't perform, didn't play to the camera. His life was real, and real life doesn't care about TV schedules. While the crew filmed, projects stalled, classes were interrupted, Animals needed care. Storms rolled in. Responsibilities doubled. Fans showed up unannounced. Vehicles clogged paths meant for horses. Tourists wandered into dangerous areas. The quiet he once relied on became a luxury he could no longer afford. For a man who sought solitude, fame became something else entirely. A predator that tracked every step, waited at every boundary, and demanded more every season. The first real battles didn't start with fans or fame. They started with the county office. One morning, inspectors arrived with clipboards, cameras, and a stack of paperwork. They weren't there to learn or appreciate his way of living. They were there to measure it, judge it, and regulate it. They questioned the buildings he'd crafted by hand. They scrutinized the timber frame structures made from fallen trees. They asked whether his traditional methods met modern code. To Eustace, these weren't simple compliance questions. They were threats. Every inspection felt like the world telling him he was wrong for living differently. Zoning officials pointed to lines on maps. Neighbors filed complaints about boundaries and property use. Some claimed his cabins weren't up to standard. Others said Turtle Island was growing too fast or drawing too many visitors. Every letter from the county cut like a blade. Every demand for upgrades felt like an attempt to erase the old ways he fought to preserve his buildings weren't violations. They were classrooms. His shelters weren't unsafe. They were built stronger than most modern homes, but the system didn't care about tradition, only procedures. The disputes grew louder. The pressure mounted. At times, Eustace was forced to halt classes, cancel events, and redirect all his energy into meetings, hearings, and negotiations that dragged on for months. To the outside world, it was just paperwork. To Eustace, it was the beginning of a war over the soul of Turtle Island. The legal battles didn't come as a single blow. They came as a slow, grinding storm. At first, Eustace believed the disputes would settle themselves, that reason would win out, that officials would recognize Turtle Island as a place of learning, not a business to dissect. But months turned into years, and each passing season brought more paperwork, more hearings, more demands that pulled him away from the very land he was fighting to protect. There were days when classes had to be halted because inspectors showed up without warning. Days when volunteers arrived eager to help, only to find Eustace sitting at a table covered in documents instead of guiding them through the forest nights, when he returned to the cabin exhausted not from work, but from arguing definitions, codes, and regulations with people who didn't understand his way of life. The county's shutdown order hit hardest. In a single moment, Turtle Island, his living classroom, his life's purpose, was declared non-compliant. Students couldn't come, programs were canceled, donations slowed, bills didn't. The preserve felt unnaturally quiet, as if even the woods sensed the tension hanging in the air. He hired lawyers, though the idea of paying someone to explain his lifestyle to a courtroom felt absurd. The legal fees stacked higher than any woodpile he'd ever built, and still, he refused to compromise the soul of Turtle Island. He would bring things to code where possible, but he would not turn his sanctuary into a bureaucratic checklist. Every document, every motion, every signature pulled him further from the forest and deeper into a world he never wanted to enter. It wasn't the physical labor breaking him. It was the emotional toll of defending something that should never have required defending. In his words, I was spending more time in courtrooms than in the woods. That's when I knew something had to change. As the legal storm swirled, another shadow began creeping toward Turtle Island. One born from whispers, speculation, and the dangerous power of rumor. In the mountains surrounding the preserve, hikers occasionally became lost, injured, or disoriented. It happened for decades before Eustace ever set foot there. Rugged terrain, sudden storms, and that was the reality of wilderness. But reality didn't matter online. Whenever someone went missing anywhere within miles of his land, internet sleuths, blog writers, and rumor-hungry locals sometimes dragged Turtle Island's name into the conversation. A few twisted the stories, claiming connections that didn't exist. Some confused the region's general wilderness with his actual preserve. Others simply used his notoriety from mountain men to fuel dramatic theories. Eustace was never accused of wrongdoing, not once. Yet the rumors created an atmosphere he never asked for. Increased patrols, unexpected knockings on his door, helicopters sweeping the ridges, and strangers showing up asking questions that made no sense. Worst of all were the unannounced search parties. Well-meaning, but misguided. They walked onto his land during active classes, spooking visitors, and disrupting the peaceful quiet he worked so hard to maintain. They weren't looking for trouble, but trouble always followed when fear took the wheel. Eustace could feel the pressure tightening. It wasn't anger he felt, it was sadness. Sadness that his home, his sanctuary, was becoming a magnet for suspicion simply because it was remote, silent, and easy to blame. When people vanish in the wilderness, he once said, the nearest landmark becomes the first suspect. Even when the truth cleared the air, the damage lingered. Rumors, once born, rarely die. While the lawsuits and rumors swirled outside Turtle Island, a different kind of pressure was building inside it. One that came from the very show that introduced Eustace to millions of viewers. At first, the partnership with mountain men felt natural. They wanted authenticity. He lived authenticity. But as the seasons passed, the line between storytelling and real life began to blur. Filming schedules clashed with daily responsibilities. Crews wanted moments of tension, conflict, and triumph, all captured within tight production windows. But the wilderness doesn't work on a schedule. Sometimes a task that looked simple on camera required days of preparation. Other times the weather turned, animals needed care, or students depended on him. Real life wasn't dramatic enough for TV, and TV wasn't patient enough for real life. Small disagreements emerged. Producers pushed for bigger moments. Eustace pushed back, wanting honesty over spectacle. Scenes were delayed, tempers flared. The crew sometimes grew frustrated when Eustace prioritized actual emergencies. A broken fence, an injured animal, a sudden storm, overplanned shots. Then came the fatigue, the constant presence of cameras, the sense that every action needed to be explained, justified, or performed for an audience he never asked for. He wasn't angry at the crew, many of them respected him deeply. But the weight of performing while maintaining a preserve grew heavier every year. Visitors interrupted takes. Tourists wandered into scenes. Helicopters from search teams buzzed overhead. Inspectors arrived during filming. Everything collided. The tension wasn't explosive. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, quiet erosion. The kind that wears down mountains over time. Eustace didn't blame the show, but he could feel it pulling him away from the life he was trying to protect. There wasn't one single catastrophe that broke Eustace Conway. It was a slow accumulation of moments, frustrations, and invasions that finally pushed him past his limits. The breaking point came quietly, disguised as an ordinary day. It began with legal threats waiting in his mailbox. A new notice, more demands, more deadlines. Before he could even process it, a county inspector's truck rolled down the gravel path, arriving unannounced, clipboard in hand. He was in the middle of teaching a class, guiding students through fire-making techniques, when he saw the vehicle pulling up. The students watched as he tried to balance two worlds, one rooted in ancient wisdom, the other suffocating him with bureaucracy. The inspector wanted immediate access to structures, water systems, and paperwork. He hadn't even had time to complete because filming had swallowed his week. Then the cameras arrived, demanding shots for the day's schedule. Tasks staged at the worst possible time. A crew member asked for a repeat take of a scene where Eustace chopped wood, even though a real emergency needed his attention. A fence had collapsed in the night, and animals needed securing before they wandered onto the road. As he tended to the fence, he caught sight of strangers standing beyond the tree line. Fans who had slipped onto the property, hoping for pictures. Unaware of the danger, they ignored signs, ignored boundaries, and ignored his requests to stay back. Everything collided in a single hour. The inspector's questions, the fans' intrusion, the crew's pressure, the paperwork piling up, the fragile classes disrupted once again. He later described that day with one sentence. That was the day the wilderness stopped feeling like home. Not because the land turned against him, but because the world refused to leave him alone long enough to breathe. When Eustace finally stepped away from Mountain Men, there was no dramatic farewell, no public announcement, no final monologue for the cameras. It was a retreat as subtle and natural as the turning of a season. Viewers didn't realize it at first. Fans wondered why he appeared less. Online threads asked if he was taking time off. But behind the scenes, his decision had already been made. He drifted slowly out of the show's orbit, like a bird peeling away from a noisy flock to glide into quieter skies. Some weeks, he filmed less, other weeks. Not at all. The crew noticed his growing distance. Not anger, not bitterness, just exhaustion. He became harder to reach. Schedules slipped. Calls went unanswered. Turtle Island, once filled with cameras and gear, felt strangely peaceful as production days dwindled. Fans would later piece it together. One season, he was central. The next, he was absent. The show moved forward without him, because preventing his departure wasn't an option. His life was the woods, not Hollywood. Away from the spotlight, Eustace began spending more time in the deeper reaches of Turtle Island, areas few visitors ever saw. He rebuilt trails, repaired shelters, tended gardens, sat beside streams, in silence. He reconnected with the land the way he did before fame came knocking. Those closest to him said he looked lighter, calmer, more rooted. Without cameras, without deadlines, without the chaos of public curiosity, Eustace returned to the rhythm that had guided him his entire life. Some men leave the spotlight loudly. Eustace walked until it disappeared behind him. The truth, when Eustace finally shared it, wasn't filled with anger or regret. It wasn't a condemnation of the show or the people who worked on it. Instead, it was quiet, humble, and deeply personal. A reflection of who he's always been. In a rare moment of openness, he explained, "I didn't leave because of the show. I left because the world was pulling me away from the man I'm supposed to be." That sentence echoed through the community of fans who had followed his journey from the beginning. It wasn't conflict that drove him away. It was clarity. The clarity that his purpose wasn't to entertain millions, but to protect the small piece of earth he had devoted his life to. Turtle Island wasn't just a preserve. It was the physical expression of his soul. Every lawsuit, every inspection, every rumor, every uninvited visitor chipped away at the peace he needed to thrive. The show amplified everything, the good and the bad, until the noise became too loud to ignore. He made his final decision alone, walking the boundary of Turtle Island at sunrise. The land was covered in fog, the woods damp and quiet. He realized he stood at a crossroads: continue fighting the forces pulling him away from his purpose, or return fully to the life he had built long before cameras found him. He chose the mountains. He chose the quiet. He chose the version of himself untouched by fame, lawsuits, or conflict. In the end, Eustace didn't leave Mountain Men. He simply walked back into the wilderness, the only place he ever truly belonged.